Unmasking the Holiday Love Lies, a shocking true story revealed. Hook. What if the person you trusted the most was hiding a dark secret? In this spine-chilling story, Cathy's life takes a terrifying twist when she uncovers the shocking truth about her husband, Peter. You won't believe what happens next. Asterisk, is there truly a way out of the darkness? Or are we all destined to be part of it? Asterisk, keep watching to find out. It was a bitter cold night when the town of Willow Creek saw its first snowfall of the year. Cars slid along the slick roads, tires screeching as they tried to maintain control. And in the distance, a house stood isolated, casting long shadows from the flickering porch light. Inside, the warmth was almost unbearable compared to the freezing air outside. Cathy, wrapped in an old knitted sweater, paced the living room. She hadn't expected to be alone tonight. Her husband, Peter, was supposed to be home hours ago, but something felt wrong. The clock ticked louder as she waited, the silence heavy. Then the door creaked. Her heart raced as she glanced toward it, expecting Peter's familiar face. But it wasn't Peter. A tall figure stood in the doorway, just outside the light. The shape of a man, but his features were hidden in shadow. "Who's there?" Cathy's voice shook, barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move. "Peter," she called again, but still no answer. Her breath quickened. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Then a noise, a faint scrape of a shoe on the floor, followed by a muffled giggle. Cathy froze. Her instincts told her to run, but she couldn't move. The man stepped forward into the dim light. It wasn't Peter. This man had a smile, but it wasn't one of kindness. His eyes, dark and hollow, locked with hers. The room seemed to close in around her. Her pulse was deafening in her ears. Then he spoke. "Peter won't be home tonight." His voice was low, cold. Cathy's mind raced. Was this a prank? She took a step back, ready to call the police. But then, the man's smile grew wider. "Peter is closer than you think." Her stomach churned. She could feel the weight of the words press down on her chest. Her mind struggled to understand what he meant. The figure leaned forward, his voice now a whisper. "He's been watching, just like me." Cathy gasped, the room spinning. What did that mean? Before she could react, the man stepped back, disappearing into the shadows of the night. The door slammed shut. She stood there, frozen, her heart pounding. Was he gone? Cathy waited, trembling. Then she heard it. A muffled noise from upstairs. Slowly, cautiously, she made her way toward the stairs. Each step was louder than the last. As she reached the top, the door to the bedroom was slightly ajar. The dim light flickered inside. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob. What was she about to find? The truth about Peter? Or something much worse? Then, as the door creaked open, Cathy's breath caught. The room was empty, but Peter's suitcase, open and half-packed, lay on the bed. And in the corner there was a note. It wasn't from Peter. It was in the man's handwriting. "Don't trust him." Her world crashed. What was going on? Who was Peter really? Cathy's heart sank. The man's words echoed in her mind. "Peter won't be home tonight." And that was when Cathy understood. Peter wasn't coming back. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the note. It was cold to the touch, the paper thin and brittle. She stared at the words, unable to make sense of them. But something in her gut told her the truth was worse than she could imagine. Her thoughts raced, frantic. What had Peter gotten himself into? What did the man mean when he said Peter was watching? Cathy's breath came in shallow gasps. She glanced back at the dark hallway behind her, as if expecting someone to appear. The silence was suffocating, but the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. She stepped toward the window, peering outside, half expecting to see the figure standing in the yard. But nothing. Nothing but the quiet, snow-covered street. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling. Something was wrong. Her hands gripped the note tighter. Was Peter involved with this man? Had he been lying to her all along? She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. There had to be another explanation. But deep down, she knew there wasn't. Cathy's eyes darted to the door. The noise from upstairs, the soft thudding. Was it Peter? She couldn't wait any longer. With the note clenched in her fist, she rushed up the stairs creaking under her weight. Every step was heavy, as if the house itself was warning her to stop. When she reached the landing, she paused. The door to their bedroom was wide open now. Her heart skipped a beat as she pushed it open. The room was eerily quiet. The suitcase was still on the bed. The clothes strewn about, Peter's things, but there was something else, too. Something dark. Her eyes settled on the small bloodstain on the carpet. It was fresh. A trail led to the closet. Cathy's breath caught in her throat. She slowly approached the door, the blood chilling her skin. With shaking hands, she turned the handle. The door swung open. Inside, the closet was empty, but the walls, smeared with dark red marks, told a different story. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she fell to the floor, her mind unable to process the horror in front of her. What had Peter been hiding? Had the man in the doorway been telling the truth? Before she could collect herself, a sound interrupted her. A faint, familiar sound. Footsteps, heavy and slow. Someone was in the house. Cathy froze, panic rising in her chest. There was nowhere to run, no place to hide. The footsteps grew louder, and then a voice. It was Peter's voice, but it wasn't the same. It was darker, angrier. Cathy, the voice called, low and menacing. Her blood ran cold. The door to the bedroom creaked again, and there, standing in the doorway, was Peter. But something in his eyes had changed. They were no longer the eyes she loved. They were cold, empty. Cathy's throat tightened. She couldn't breathe. And then, Peter's lips curled into a twisted smile. You shouldn't have come up here. Cathy's pulse raced. She was face to face with the man she thought she knew. But this wasn't Peter anymore. And the horrifying truth finally sank in. Cathy's heart slammed against her chest as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The man standing before her, once her husband, now looked like a stranger. His face was pale, his eyes dark, as if some part of him had been swallowed by shadows. The way he stood in the doorway, unmoving, sent a chill through her bones. Peter, what's happening? What's going on? Her voice was barely a whisper, her words stumbling over each other. Peter didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, the floor creaking under his weight. His movements were slow, deliberate. Cathy instinctively backed away, the fear paralyzing her. I don't understand, she gasped, tears welling in her eyes. Where have you been? What's going on? Peter's lips twisted into a smile, but it wasn't a smile of comfort. It was something darker. I told you, Cathy. You shouldn't have come upstairs. His voice had a hollow ring to it, like an echo from a different world. The air around her seemed to thicken, heavy and suffocating. She couldn't breathe. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her legs were frozen. Peter took another step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. Her body shook, her thoughts racing. Was this the same man she married? The man who had promised to always protect her? Her pulse quickened as Peter's voice broke the silence again. You should have stayed away from the truth. The words were cold, like daggers piercing through her chest. Cathy's mind reeled. What truth? What had Peter been hiding from her all this time? Suddenly, a movement behind him caught her eye. It was the same figure from earlier, the shadowy man who had appeared at the door. He stepped into the room, his dark eyes locked onto hers. You didn't think you could just escape, did you? He said, his voice like a hiss. Cathy's breath caught in her throat. Who was this man? What was going on? Peter glanced back at the figure, then returned his gaze to Cathy. "You always knew something was wrong," he said, almost too casually. "You just didn't want to see it." Cathy's heart pounded. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but it didn't make sense. "Peter, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Please, what's happening?" For the first time, Peter's expression shifted, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't identify. "I never wanted you to know, but now it's too late." The figure behind him took a step forward, and Cathy's instinct screamed at her to run, to escape. But she couldn't move. The room was spinning, the walls closing in. "You've seen too much," Peter continued, his voice like ice. The figure reached into his coat, pulling out a small device, holding it out to Peter. Peter took it without a word, his eyes still on Cathy. She could barely breathe, her body shaking uncontrollably. Peter looked at the device, his finger hovering over a button. "Cathy," he said softly, his voice now unsettlingly calm, "I never wanted you to be part of this, but you've already seen everything. So now," he paused, a twisted smile creeping across his face. "Now, there's no going back." Cathy's stomach turned as she realized the gravity of his words. What had Peter really been involved in? What was this device? Before she could react, the door slammed shut, the sound echoing like thunder through the house. Her heart raced as she spun around, desperately searching for an escape. But the room had become a prison. The only way out was the truth, and the truth was darker than she could ever have imagined. She was trapped. That Cathy's heart slammed against her chest as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The man standing before her, once her husband, now looked like a stranger. His face was pale, his eyes dark, as if some part of him had been swallowed by shadows. The way he stood in the doorway, unmoving, sent a chill through her bones. "Peter, what's happening? What's going on?" Her voice was barely a whisper, her words stumbling over each other. Peter didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, the floor creaking under his weight. His movements were slow, deliberate. Cathy instinctively backed away, the fear paralyzing her. "I don't understand," she gasped, tears welling in her eyes. "Where have you been? What's going on?" Peter's lips twisted into a smile, but it wasn't a smile of comfort. It was something darker. "I told you, Cathy. You shouldn't have come upstairs." His voice had a hollow ring to it, like an echo from a different world. The air around her seemed to thicken, heavy and suffocating. She couldn't breathe. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her legs were frozen. Peter took another step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. Her body shook, her thoughts racing. Was this the same man she married? The man who had promised to always protect her? Her pulse quickened as Peter's voice broke the silence again. "You should have stayed away from the truth." The words were cold, like daggers piercing through her chest. Cathy's mind reeled. What truth? What had Peter been hiding from her all this time? Suddenly, a movement behind him caught her eye. It was the same figure from earlier, the shadowy man who had appeared at the door. He stepped into the room, his dark eyes locked onto hers. "You didn't think you could just escape, did you?" he said, his voice like a hiss. Cathy's breath caught in her throat. Who was this man? What was going on? Peter glanced back at the figure, then returned his gaze to Cathy. "You always knew something was wrong," he said, almost too casually. "You just didn't want to see it." Cathy's heart pounded. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but it didn't make sense. "Peter, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Please, what's happening?" For the first time, Peter's expression shifted, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't identify. "I never wanted you to know, but now it's too late." The figure behind him took a step forward, and Cathy's instinct screamed at her to run, to escape. But she couldn't move. The room was spinning, the walls closing in. "You've seen too much," Peter continued, his voice like ice. The figure reached into his coat, pulling out a small device, holding it out to Peter. Peter took it without a word, his eyes still on Cathy. She could barely breathe, her body shaking uncontrollably. Peter looked at the device, his finger hovering over a button. "Cathy," he said softly, his voice now unsettlingly calm. "I never wanted you to be part of this, but you've already seen everything. So now," he paused, a twisted smile creeping across his face. "Now, there's no going back." Cathy's stomach turned as she realized the gravity of his words. What had Peter really been involved in? What was this device? Before she could react, the door slammed shut, the sound echoing like thunder through the house. Her heart raced as she spun around, desperately searching for an escape. But the room had become a prison. The only way out was the truth. And the truth was darker than she could ever have imagined. The air was thick with tension, suffocating Cathy as she stood frozen in the middle of the room. Peter's eyes gleamed with something cold and calculated. He was no longer the man she loved, the man she thought she knew. Her mind struggled to process the horror unfolding before her. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she searched for a way out, but the walls seemed to close in tighter with every passing second. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The figure, still standing at the door, moved closer, his presence a dark weight in the room. "Peter, please," Cathy whispered, desperation creeping into her voice. "Tell me what's happening. What have you done?" Peter didn't respond immediately. Instead, he lifted the device in his hand, his fingers tracing it almost lovingly. "Everything," he said, his voice barely above a murmur. "I've done everything for us. For our future." Cathy's stomach lurched. Future? What was he talking about? Her breath quickened, her eyes darting between Peter and the figure by the door. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What's the device?" Peter finally turned his gaze to the object in his hand, his eyes momentarily softening. "It's just the beginning," he replied, his tone distant. The figure behind him chuckled, low and unsettling. "Too much time wasted already," he muttered, as if the conversation didn't matter at all. Peter's smile returned, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "The truth is, we've been waiting for this moment, waiting for you to see it." Cathy felt a sudden chill, as if the very air around her had turned to ice. Her mind struggled to keep up with the words, but one thought clung to her. This wasn't about their marriage. This wasn't about love. This was something far darker, far more dangerous. "You've been watching me, haven't you?" she asked, her voice shaky but resolute. Peter didn't deny it. "We've been watching," he said, his voice thick with something unrecognizable. The room felt like it was shrinking, the weight of the truth, whatever it was, pressing down on her. Cathy's body trembled, the coldness in the room seeping into her bones. "What have you done to me?" she whispered, her words barely audible. Peter didn't answer. Instead, he stepped toward her. His eyes gleamed with an almost unsettling satisfaction, as if this was all part of some twisted plan she didn't yet understand. Cathy wanted to run, but she couldn't. She was trapped. Peter's fingers brushed her arm, sending a shock of cold through her skin. "It's all for you," he said, his voice soft, almost affectionate. "Everything." But Cathy couldn't hold back the fear clawing at her chest. The more she thought, the more she realized. The man standing before her wasn't Peter anymore. It was something else. The device in his hand, she could barely make out its shape, but something told her it wasn't just a simple gadget. It was a key to whatever darkness Peter had fallen into. The figure by the door stepped forward again, his eyes locked onto Cathy. "Don't worry, Cathy," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "The game is just starting." And then, without warning, Peter pressed the button on the device. The sound that followed was deafening, a high-pitched hum that seemed to vibrate through her skull. Cathy's vision blurred. Her body jerked, as if pulled by an invisible force. It felt like the ground was slipping away beneath her feet. The walls around her seemed to bend, stretch, distort. And then darkness. Complete, suffocating darkness. For a long moment, Cathy couldn't feel anything. No sound, no movement. Just silence. And then a voice, a whisper. Familiar yet haunting. "Cathy, it's just the beginning." She opened her eyes, but nothing made sense. She was still in the room, but it was different now. The air, the shadows, everything felt wrong. Peter, the man she once knew, was gone. And the nightmare was only just beginning. That Cathy's breath caught in her throat. The darkness around her wasn't just an absence of light. It was oppressive, suffocating, as if the very room itself had turned against her. Her limbs felt heavy, and for a moment she wondered if she had lost her mind. But then a cold draft whispered through the room, sending shivers down her spine. She could see nothing but the faintest shadows, shapes moving in the corners of her vision. Her heart hammered in her chest as she struggled to stand, her legs unsteady beneath her. The air tasted stale, thick with an unfamiliar scent, metallic, sharp. Everything felt off. Suddenly, the hum returned, vibrating the very air, growing louder. The walls seemed to pulse with it, as if the house itself was alive, breathing. Cathy gasped, her senses flooded with panic. Where was she? Where was Peter? She spun around, but there was nothing but the endless blackness. Then a sound, a faint whisper like the echo of her name. Cathy. It was a voice, but not Peter's. Her blood ran cold. She tried to call out, but her voice barely made a sound, swallowed by the strange, oppressive atmosphere. And then, out of the darkness, a figure materialized. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by shadows. The outline of his form was barely discernible, but Cathy could feel his presence, the weight of his stare pressing on her from every direction. Her chest tightened. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. He simply stepped closer, his movements fluid, almost unnatural. And then, as he came into the dim light, Cathy froze. It was Peter, but his face was wrong, twisted, unrecognizable. His eyes were darker than before, black holes that seemed to swallow all light. His lips stretched into that same chilling smile, the one that had haunted her in the moments before the device was activated. "Peter," Cathy's voice cracked, fear and disbelief filling her throat. But this wasn't the man she had married. This was something else. "I told you, Cathy," he whispered, his voice deep and distorted. "You never should have known the truth." The air grew colder, the darkness around them pressing in tighter. She staggered back, shaking her head, trying to make sense of it all. What's happening?" Peter, or whatever this thing was, took another step forward. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice low, like a predator savoring its prey. "I told you everything was for us, for our future." Cathy's mind reeled, her heart raced, hammering in her chest. The truth, what was it? What had Peter done? The man before her stepped even closer, and she could smell something sharp, something metallic on his breath. "Why are you doing this?" she choked out, her voice barely audible. Peter's smile widened. "Because..." Cathy, a weave crossed over. "And you've just joined us." A freezing chill ran down her spine as the words hit her. What did he mean by "we've crossed over"? Before she could process anything else, the figure behind him, the shadowy man from earlier, stepped forward. He held something in his hand, a small, glowing object. Cathy could feel its pull, a magnetic force drawing her toward it, as if it held the power to draw her into some abyss. "Don't you see?" The figure spoke, his voice quiet, but filled with unshakable certainty. "The truth is, you've always been part of this. You just didn't know it yet." The ground beneath Cathy's feet felt unstable, like the world itself was shifting, tearing apart at the seams. The figure moved closer, raising the glowing object toward her. And then, with one final, chilling word, Peter spoke. "Welcome to the new world, Cathy." Before she could react, the light from the object exploded, swallowing her whole. Everything went white, and then darkness again. Only this time, it wasn't just the absence of light. It was the beginning of something far worse. The white light consumed her. For a moment, Cathy felt weightless, as if she were floating in a void. Her body felt detached, as if she were no longer in control, lost in a space that defied all logic. Then, without warning, the light began to fade. Slowly, painfully, it ebbed away, and she felt her feet return to solid ground. But this wasn't the room she had been in before. This place, this new world, was unlike anything she had ever seen. The air was thick, heavy with a metallic scent, a strange mixture of rust and decay. The ground beneath her was cold and damp, and the walls around her seemed to pulse with a low hum, vibrating with an energy she couldn't understand. She tried to move, but her legs were stiff, unresponsive. Her heart pounded in her chest, the fear creeping up her spine like an icy hand. Cathy blinked, trying to focus, but her vision was blurred. Then she heard a voice. It was Peter's voice again, but distorted, warped as if it had been twisted through 1,000 echoes. "Cathy," he called her name low and menacing. "You're here now. You're one of us." The words felt like a slap to her face. One of us? What was he talking about? The ground shifted beneath her feet, as though it were alive. She stumbled, trying to catch her balance, but it was as if the very earth was trying to reject her. And then, through the haze of confusion, she saw him. Peter, but not the man she had known. This version of him was different. His face was paler, almost ghostly, his eyes completely black now. No whites, no pupils, just endless voids. He stood before her, his smile cold and empty, his posture unnaturally still, as though he were waiting for her to understand. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her throat felt dry, her mouth parched. It was as if she had been in this place for years, lost in time. "You still don't get it, do you?" Peter's voice echoed around her, filling the air like a sickening melody. "You thought you were just living a normal life, didn't you? A house, a job, love. But you were always meant for this." Cathy's stomach churned. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. This wasn't the Peter she had known. This wasn't her husband. Whatever he had become, it was far beyond her comprehension. As the truth sank deeper into her bones, she felt the darkness close in again. Only now, it wasn't just a void. It was a world. A new world. A world where nothing was familiar. The figure, the man who had been in the shadows earlier, stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Do you see now?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with certainty. "You've crossed over. Welcome to the new reality." Cathy's breath hitched. Reality? What did that even mean? The man reached out, placing a cold hand on her arm, sending a shock of icy fear through her entire body. And then she understood. This was no longer the world she had known. She wasn't in the same place anymore. She was trapped in something darker, something twisted, a reality where she no longer belonged. Her heart sank, the realization settling deep in her chest. Peter, the man she had trusted, had led her here. But she wasn't the only one. There were others, too, figures emerging from the darkness, shadows of the past, of people who had crossed over before her. All around her, she could feel their eyes on her. Not a single one of them seemed alive in the way she had once understood life. They were empty, hollow, trapped, just like her. And then Peter spoke again, his voice low and almost affectionate. "It's time for you to understand, Cathy. You were always part of this. From the very beginning, The room around her seemed to shift again, the walls stretching, bending like they were alive. She could hear faint whispers now, voices from beyond, from a place where nothing made sense. "I didn't want to do this," Peter continued, "but you were always going to find out. And now, it's your turn to stay, to become one of us." The ground beneath Cathy began to shake violently. Her body screamed for escape, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows closed in, the figures around her moving closer. And in that moment, Cathy understood. She wasn't meant to escape. She was meant to be part of this world, this twisted place. This was her new reality now. The walls trembled again, and the floor beneath Cathy's feet cracked with a loud snap, as though the very foundation of the place was unstable, ready to collapse. But there was no escape. The figures closed in on her, their hollow eyes watching her every move. She could feel their cold stares, feel the weight of their presence pressing in from all sides. Peter stepped closer, his face still twisted in that unrecognizable, sinister smile. "There's no way back, Cathy," he whispered, his voice dark and distant, as if he were no longer the man she knew. "You were always meant to be here, with us." Her chest tightened as the truth, awful and undeniable, sank deeper into her soul. There was no going home. This place wasn't just some twisted version of her world. It was a different realm entirely, a place where the boundaries of time and reality had been shattered. The shadows of those who had come before her swirled around, their figures flickering like faded memories, moving like lost souls. And the whispers, they grew louder. Cathy turned her head frantically, searching for a way out, but there was no door, no window, nothing. "I know you're scared," Peter said softly, as if comforting her, "but you don't need to be. You'll understand soon enough. We all do." The eerie calm in his voice made her blood run cold. Her legs were frozen, her body unwilling to move. It was like the air itself was pushing against her, holding her in place. "Understand," she gasped, her voice thick with disbelief. "What are you talking about? What is this place?" Peter took another step forward, his black eyes gleaming, the hollow smile still stretched across his face. "This is the place where everything that's been lost finds its way," he said, his voice low. "Where the real world ends and something far beyond begins. You never understood the bigger picture, Cathy, but now you will." Cathy could barely breathe, the weight of his words suffocating her. "Peter, please." Her voice broke as she struggled to find her words. "I don't want this. I don't want any part of this." But the smile never faltered. "You don't get to choose anymore," he said coldly. "None of us did." The air grew colder, and Cathy shivered uncontrollably. She could feel the pull of the shadows around her, dragging her into their depths. It was like they were calling her, whispering her name in soft, mocking tones, urging her to join them. No, she couldn't give in. She had to fight. With everything she had left, Cathy willed her legs to move. She took a step backward, then another, her heart racing with panic. But the shadows closed in around her, faster now, pressing in on all sides. Peter's voice echoed again, his tone almost soothing. "You'll understand, Cathy. You'll be one of us soon enough." The ground beneath her shifted once more, and Cathy stumbled, her body suddenly heavy, her vision blurring. The figures around her stretched their arms toward her, as if pulling her into their darkness. But she couldn't let them take her. She couldn't let herself become one of them. Her hands shook as she reached out, desperate for something, anything, that could pull her out of this nightmare. And then, just as the shadows seemed to swallow her whole, something unexpected happened. A faint light broke through the darkness. It flickered at first, weak and uncertain, like a distant star in an empty sky. But it grew brighter, closer, and Cathy, with her last ounce of strength, reached toward it. The shadows recoiled, as if afraid of the light, pulling back just enough to give her a sliver of space. With every ounce of willpower she had left, Cathy forced her legs to move, inching toward the light, her fingers outstretched. The figures around her shrieked, their voices rising in agony, as if the light itself was burning them. She could feel their cold hands reaching for her, but she refused to look back. With one final, desperate push, Cathy stepped into the light, and everything went white. Then silence. The world around her felt solid again, like the ground beneath her feet was real. She opened her eyes, squinting against the brightness. But when her vision cleared, the world had changed. She was standing in a forest now, the sun shining down, the air crisp and fresh. It was familiar. A strange peace washed over her, but the unease didn't fade. The light, though warm, seemed to carry a weight of its own, a warning. Cathy's heart still raced. She was free for now, but she could feel it, the pull. The darkness was still there, lurking beneath the surface, just out of sight. And no matter where she went, no matter how far she ran, she knew it would follow her. It wasn't over. Not yet. Cathy stood still, her breath shallow as the reality around her began to settle in. The forest, though tranquil, felt off, like it was just a veneer for something darker lurking beneath. She scanned the trees, the silence too perfect, too complete. No birds, no rustling leaves, only the faint whisper of the wind brushing against the ground. The light that had pulled her out of the shadows now seemed less comforting, casting strange shadows of its own across the path before her. Her legs still shook, every step a reminder of how close she had come to losing herself forever. She wasn't sure how she had escaped, or if she had escaped at all. Her mind screamed for answers, but there was no one to give them to her. Just the forest, just the silence, the memories of the dark place, the world where Peter had become something else, still clung to her like a shadow. What had he meant when he said she was one of them? What had happened to her husband, the man she had loved, the man she had married? Her heart ached, a dull, gnawing pain in her chest as she thought of him, his black eyes, that twisted smile. Had he truly been lost? Or had he been part of this all along? As if on cue, a figure emerged from the trees, stepping into the light. Cathy's breath caught in her throat as she recognized him. It was Peter, but not Peter. His face was ashen, his eyes still black, hollow, endless. The darkness she had escaped from had followed him into this new world. Cathy, his voice was a low, almost affectionate whisper. You think you've escaped, but there is no escape. Her pulse quickened, her instinct screamed at her to run, to get away, but her legs refused to move. You're already part of this, Peter continued, his voice like a distant memory. You always have been. Cathy's throat tightened, a cold realization sinking in. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. Peter took a slow step forward, his face a mask of empty affection. You thought you could outrun it, he said softly, but you can't outrun what's inside you. Cathy's eyes widened in terror, her feet suddenly unable to move as the forest seemed to close in, its shadows wrapping around her like a vice. This wasn't freedom. It was just the beginning of something far worse. She had escaped the darkness, only to find herself trapped in another. And this time, there would be no light to save her. That Cathy's breath came in ragged gasps as she stood frozen, staring at Peter, his figure now a mere silhouette against the harsh light that surrounded them. The world felt unreal, as if the fabric of everything had torn open, leaving her in some strange limbo between realities. She wanted to scream, to run, to escape again. But her legs were heavy, her mind clouded. Every instinct told her to fight, to push back against whatever this new world was. But something in her heart knew there was no escape. Not anymore. Peter's eyes, those dark, endless eyes, locked onto hers with an intensity that sent a chill crawling up her spine. "You're still here," he whispered, as if it was a revelation, a truth that was far too late to deny. "You were always meant to be here, Cathy. You've always belonged to this place." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. She tried to swallow the lump in her throat, the wave of terror that threatened to crush her, but all she could do was stand there, the weight of his gaze pinning her in place. "This isn't what I wanted," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted any of this." Peter's lips curled into that twisted smile. "Neither did I. But sometimes we don't have a choice. Sometimes it chooses us." The wind rustled through the trees, a soft, mournful sound that made the forest feel more like a graveyard. Cathy felt her heart ache, not just with fear, but with a deep, hollow sadness. She had loved Peter. She had loved him with everything she had. And now he was gone. Maybe he was never truly there to begin with. The world seemed to darken once again, the light retreating as the shadows of the forest gathered around her. But this time, it wasn't suffocating, it was welcoming. Cathy took one last look at Peter, the man she had known, and she realized in that moment she wasn't alone. There were others here, lost souls like her, trying to find their way, trying to understand what had happened to them. And just as the darkness began to take her again, she understood. She wasn't fighting for survival anymore. She wasn't running. She was becoming part of it. The shadows wrapped around her, pulling her in, and Cathy closed her eyes, no longer afraid. The light had gone, but so had the fear. And in the end, it was the only thing left.